the Architecture 2030 Energy Ordinance. So, who would like to start? Mr. Casey.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Ordinance Committee. I'm Paul Casey, Community Development Director. With me today is Mike Gable. He's our consultant with Mike Gable and Associates, and he will give the bulk of the presentation, walk you through the ordinance, what we're doing. This is a relatively complex issue, and George Estrella, the Chief Building Official, is here as well to answer any questions. I thought I would just introduce briefly and give you a little context about how we got here and why we're here today. If you recall back in, well, I'll just start in February of this year, when you had a coalition of people from the community, builders, architects, energy specialists, and others, who approached you as the Architecture 2030 Coalition, a local group representing a national effort to really try to get greater energy efficiency at the local government in our buildings to try to start addressing greenhouse gas emissions and global warming and the such. They came to you and asked you to adopt the Architecture 2030 Challenge, and one of the key components of that was a desire to draft an ordinance to have local buildings exceed the state requirements for energy efficiency, which is State Title 24 for shorthand, but to have a local energy ordinance that would require greater energy efficiency for new buildings and major remodels in town than what's currently required of the state, recognizing that what the state of California has is already a real gold standard for the nation when it comes to energy efficiency. So we're really taking it up to a new level by trying to adopt this local ordinance. Council unanimously said, yes, please go work on that. We met with the Sustainable Subcommittee of the City Council and kind of scoped it out a little bit and had direction to go forth and draft. And so we did. We brought in Mr. Gable, who has real expertise statewide in not only drafting local energy ordinances, but also understanding what's going on at the state level with the Energy Commission and others. And so he's been a real great help to us. We held a public meeting down on the waterfront. Good turnout, about 30 people over a lunch that we advertised in the newspaper and other places, and got good feedback just kind of on the basic concepts. We walked through what are some key decision points you would have to walk through.
You'll get good turnout over lunch.
Yes, that's right. And so we just kind of walked through at that public meeting some basic parameters of things we needed to think about, got some feedback, had some good dialogue. We then went back and Mr. Gable drafted an ordinance and worked with staff, and then we held another public meeting with the actual draft ordinance in the Gephardt room. Again, well noticed and well attended with different sectors of our building community, and had a good conversation about the ordinance, and we've made some adjustments since then as well. So that's why we're here today. We have a draft ordinance that's been vetted a little bit, but this is another opportunity to have some public input and also get your input and guidance. And if it's ready to go, you would forward the draft ordinance to council for introduction. This is a little bit different in that we do require approval from the State Energy Commission before we can implement our local ordinance. And so council action will not be the end of it. We'll then submit an application to the state and try to get their concurrence and approval for our local ordinance, and then we can begin implementation, which we hope to occur by the early part of next year. And so we can talk about that a little bit more as well. At this point, if there are any general questions, we can answer them. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Mr. Gable to kind of walk you through the draft ordinance.
You know, I did have one thing. I'm not sure. Mr. Barnwell, do you have anything? Mr. House? Thank you, Ms. Peterson. And it just sort of struck me as a little bit odd, so maybe you could address it in your comments, and that is that these are some of the most stringent energy requirements for new construction in the state of California. However, we've determined it's exempt from CEQA. So if you could reconcile that a little bit for me. Mr. Vincent.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, the exemption that we're using regarding CEQA is that the standards that are being proposed actually reduce the impact of buildings on the environment from beyond what is required under state law.
Great.
So
okay.
In any case, compliance with the proposed standards for the city's ordinance would go beyond the energy efficiency already required by the state in Title 24, and therefore would reduce any potential environmental impact associated with the energy use of proposed buildings.
Great. It comes off as a little bit inconsistent, but when you explain it that way, I hope that people understand that it's a reduction beyond what would be required under CEQA.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gable.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I just was going to take a few minutes to run through kind of an overview of what this is all about. And I'd be happy to take questions during this brief overview or at the end, whatever your pleasure. So feel free to interrupt if you have something that you're interested in pursuing. The sort of big picture here is that the Energy Commission, in its approval of local energy ordinances, is looking for the ordinance to be consistent with the state rules. That is, the terminology, the definitions, the methodology people are already using statewide to show compliance with the energy code, the state code. And so my work involved with this city and with other local jurisdictions developing something that sort of streamlines and integrates with the existing state code, but simply goes further to ensure a higher level of efficiency. The ordinance essentially contains, as the state code has mandatory requirements for buildings under certain conditions, we added a few additional local mandatory measures that we'll touch upon as one section of this ordinance. The so-called general compliance requirements have to do with the overall building's efficiency exceeding the state code by typically a percentage, better than the state code. And the expiration of this local ordinance would be consistent with the expiration of the state code, and we can talk about that some, but basically that's sort of how this is normally done. The state of California will have what they're calling 2008 standards take effect in 2009. The way the process works here is that the City Council would hear the ordinance, I guess, formally as a council and make an initial approval, and then as Paul Casey indicated, we would submit this application to the Commission, and hopefully within 4 to 6 weeks they would essentially approve it based on this cost-effectiveness study that's embedded in the application. And then finally after that it would come back to the City Council for final adoption, and at some period of time after that, 30 days or some designated date, it would take effect locally. So that's kind of the big picture. The mandatory requirements essentially have to do in residential construction with using so-called Energy Star appliances where they're installed before final inspection and where they're applicable as an appliance type that's an Energy Star, has an Energy Star rating. Swimming pools and spas, certain efficiencies of heaters, and essentially the higher efficiency 2-speed or variable speed pumps, and in mechanical systems, which really this designation has primarily to do with commercial buildings. A certain horsepower or greater fan or pump motors have to have a special higher efficiency. NEMA is the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. They have a designation. So that's really all the local requirements that are special to this ordinance on the mandatory side. The general compliance requirements are going to be divided up into low-rise residential buildings, which are essentially single-family homes or 3 or fewer stories of apartments. And those kinds of buildings will have to exceed the Title 24 state efficiency requirements by 20%, using the metric and the methodology that, again, the state already has in place. And the performance approach is a sort of a calculational method that does trade-offs between insulation and glass and mechanical efficiencies and so forth, and that's the approach that would be used to demonstrate this. 95% of permit applicants or more use that approach anyway under the current standards, so you're not imposing something difficult on the permit applicants to do this. There will be some credit for solar photovoltaic systems, but the ordinance restricts the extent to which permit applicant can get that credit. The understanding and the feeling was, I think for good reason, that I think the city wants to ensure a higher level of efficiency than the state standard as a threshold before you give additional credit for solar PV. So we'll talk briefly more about that. And then finally, the idea is to exempt additions under 100 square feet, 100 square feet or less, because that's consistent with the state code, which gives a so-called prescriptive exemption or a simplified exemption for additions that are smaller. There is a typo. Essentially, the ordinance, which will be corrected, lists 500 square feet in error, but Scott Vincent and I were working together on this, and we just missed it. But the intent is really to be consistent with the prescriptive addition in the state code. The so-called high-rise designation is a little strange. I think in Santa Barbara you're not going to go over generally more than 4 stories, but in the state of California, the 4-story...
If that, arguably.
Yeah, right, exactly. So this is kind of the hypothetical. If they ever get approved projects of that height, then under the state code we had to put in a provision which is consistent with the state code, and they call that high-rise, but it's sort of a strange designation for this application here. And the rules would be a little different, and without getting into all the technical details, it's a different set of calculational rules and procedures, and so exceeding the code by 15% is kind of like the 20% for the low-rise residential. So that's what's reasonable and I think cost-effective in this climate zone. And again, the solar PV credit would be available once you'd achieved a certain 10% better to start with. And as far as the additions go, again, we forgot the 100 square foot exemption, which we want to make sure gets in there in the draft that the council is going to see for its initial approval. For other occupancies, which really are everything else, all so-called non-residential, and even hotel-motel occupancies are sort of in this category, the permit applicants have the state-sanctioned what's called a prescriptive approach, which is a simplified calculation approach for the shell or the envelope of the building by itself, for the lighting as a separate component, which is what it's done oftentimes, or if you want to combine the two in a performance approach with mechanical systems as an option, you exceed the code by 10%. So it's sort of a 10% factor for commercial buildings, which is actually pretty stringent. We can, if you want to get into the gory details, I'll explain why. But solar PV also is an option, and again, we forgot to exempt the additions less than 100 square feet. Excuse me, that's a typo there. That should actually be less.
Mr. Gable, we have a question.
Madam
for you.
Chair,
Mr.
thank
Barnwell.
you. You mentioned something that I was thinking about when I first read this last week, and that is we're looking at the buildings, but we touch upon lighting and efficiency of lighting, which isn't always a building question. That's an outside landscaping question. And we have a lighting ordinance which prescribes, I believe we use the word wattage, to not exceed certain wattages. So to what degree are we incorporating those, both existing codes and the idea of energy saving through lights in here?
Well, I think the distinction here, which I didn't make clearly, is, and my apologies, is we're really talking about indoor lighting for this application. The state, just in 2005, has a new outdoor lighting requirement, which is a state code. It's a very new part of the code. It's not being complied with and enforced very well. They're changing the structure of it in 2008 because there have been problems. So we kind of steered clear of the city trying to adopt a more stringent version of that because there have been some problems with it. If we're going to reconsider the code here for 2008, 2009, we might consider adopting a city ordinance version of the so-called outdoor lighting component. But what I'm referring to here is essentially indoor lighting in commercial buildings. Is that clear? Or
well, it's clear, but I think you couldn't possibly know all these things. But we're right now working on amendments to our lighting code, coming through the overarching original concept of the street light design guidelines, which is now mandating some wattage figures. So should this refer to, and it also talks about outdoor lighting, not just street lighting, but outdoor lighting for residences, apartment buildings, et cetera. So should this be making a reference to that?
You know, I don't,
Madam
maybe
Chair.
the others can speak to it from a legal point of view. I think functionally, from my perspective, keeping them separate is just fine as long as the permit applicant receives that information over the counter with this information. It's apples and oranges, but maybe others will speak to that.
Mr. Vinson.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I just wanted to make it clear that this particular ordinance is not considering outdoor lighting or lighting in the public right-of-way. This is only considering lighting that's part of a new private project or alterations to non-residential lighting projects. And I would echo Mr. Gable's comments that this ordinance and its effects on efficiency can operate independently of the changes that we may have in the future to the city's outdoor lighting ordinance or the city's practices regarding lighting in the public right-of-way, while with the caveat that there's nothing that prevents those efforts from incorporating the concepts here, in other words, trying to reduce the amount of energy usage in those proposals as they come through.
Well, I'm just saying, you know, when you come to the counter and you see this, where in this are you going to find out that there are also outdoor lighting requirements that mandate wattages? That's my point. The idea that when you're going to come and do this, shouldn't this document be referencing other documents, whether or not it's included in this, whether the mandate of this includes those other documents? It seems like when we do this as an ordinance change, it should be referencing the other important components of energy
Mr.
savings.
Gable, Mr. Vincent, I think there's a gray area here that Mr. Barnwell is trying to get to, and that is the lighting that appears either in landscaping or on the sides of buildings that have nothing to do with the right-of-way lighting and the city code. However, they should probably be consistent or at least referencing. Is that, am I understanding
right,
it
because we're trying, it's within the property
so if you could
lines
address
that we're trying to do that.
piece of it, please, maybe
Madam
Mr.
Chair, I'd be
Strand.
happy to address
Mr.
that.
Vincent?
The outdoor lighting ordinance, like many of our design review ordinances, it's found in Title 22. It dictates how lighting design is reviewed by the Architectural Board of Review or the Single Family Design Board or the HLC. So to answer your question of how does one find those standards, they're in the municipal code. We have many overlapping standards that are found in various chapters of the municipal code. Some projects will touch on some of those requirements, other projects won't. So to answer the question, it's found in the municipal code. How that gets brought into the process, that's a large part of that is the counter staff for building and safety and the plan applications and the staff that helps the review bodies in processing the applications, making sure that they're complete and that they're addressing the standards. So in this sense, the fact that this particular ordinance right now is not cross-referencing other ordinances that the city has that govern how a building is constructed is not unusual. Does it mean that, there's extra work? But at the same time, it's almost, I would say it's nearly impossible to accurately cross-reference in each individual chapter all the other places an applicant needs to look, because we don't know what the applicant's proposing at this time.
That being said, Mr. Casey.
I would just want to kind of agree with Mr. Vincent and also say kind of our general approach has been, let's try to keep this ordinance relatively simple and straightforward. And one way to look at it is kind of an overlay to Title 24 requirements that new construction, as they come in for a building permit, needs to comply. And essentially for project architects and mechanical engineers and stuff, it's saying, hey, when you're talking Title 24, this is kind of our new little overlay on that you got to make sure you meet. And so that's kind of the approach we've been taking.
Mr. Barnwell?
Well, I disagree. It seems to me like if you're going to use bullet number 2 that says must use a prescriptive lighting approach to meet Title 24, some parenthetical phrase in there says, in addition to any other lighting ordinances, city ordinance or something like that. I mean, that's all I've been working on here for like 6 months is this lighting ordinance and trying to get the lighting ordinance to reference all of the other pertinent documents which have to do with lighting, but are not, I'm not suggesting some giant cross-referencing thing. But anyway, thanks, Madam Chair.
Any further comments on this? You'll work on it.
Exactly. I mean, let's discuss it after we're done with our presentation and see if there's a way we can address his concerns.
Thank you. Mr. Gable.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Briefly, just as a point of reference, technically the Energy Commission and the state is now involved in a new solar homes partnership program. The governor initiated with a large expenditure towards solar PV systems, and as a result of that initiative, there are now a state-defined set of rules, both in the determination of the performance of solar PV systems in a fairly nice reference to online calculation, but also in an installation book, which now the city can use as sort of just as a handy set of criteria to use for permit applicants who want to get credit for solar PV. So that sort of all appeared magically in the last 6 months or so. It's been really nice. And so the standard kind of the ordinance references those methods and so forth. To sort of sum this up, the application to the Energy Commission that I've worked on has the impacts of the ordinance, which essentially means starting with buildings that just meet the state code. What does it take to then go from that level of efficiency to meet the city's ordinance? And I did some case studies to show for houses, high-rise residential, or let's call it four-story residential apartments and commercial buildings, what real-world incremental measures and costs are associated with those incremental improvements. And finally, an implementation plan, which I've worked out, which has to do with the building enforcement, essentially using very simple incremental worksheets to augment the state's existing worksheets and forms. And that's pretty much it as a summary. So I think I'm done.
Thank you. Mr. Estrella, do you have anything to add? No? All righty. I have one speaker slip, unless there are questions prior to. Oh, I have a couple of other speaker slips. Any questions prior to the public comment? Okay, Mr. Hunt, followed by Tam Hunt, followed by Dave Davis. Mr. Hunt, you've been instrumental in helping us get here. Thank you very much.
We have. We actually, with Dave and a number of other folks, we've been working as a coalition to advance
I'm so sorry. Start again, please.
There we go. Tam Hunt, CEC, Energy Program Director and Staff Attorney. And we have been working with a coalition here in town of architects, builders, and nonprofit groups to bring this before you. And wanted to stress that this ordinance is tremendously good in itself. And given the context of the 2030 challenge, you will be the first in the country to go down this road. So going above Title 24 in the context of 2030 is very precedent setting. I wanted to highlight a couple different things in the ordinance that I think need some revision. In particular, we're concerned about the sunset, the expiration provision at the end of the ordinance. And it's set to expire in 1 year. And we suggest in the packet that you just received, revising that language to say, unless the Title 24 changes have no material effect in our climate zone, which may in fact happen. With the updates, there's no guarantee it's actually going to change this region. We also add a couple findings, which I think Dave will talk about in a second, but I wanted to also stress that the reason we add that in is that in our reading of the relevant code, the CEC, the Energy Commission, receives your cost study. They approve the energy reduction impact of this ordinance. When you go back to them in the future, they simply receive an updated cost study. So there's no approval at that point. So there's only one thing they approve, and that's in the beginning of the process. And this is why we say in the expiration revision, we suggest that if there is actually no impact in our climate zone, then the ordinance does not expire. Any questions on that issue?
Mr. Vinson.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, if I could address the issue of the sunset. The City Attorney's Office talked with Mr. Hunt this morning, and while we understand, and we've both read the state statute and understand what it says, I would recommend against the addition that they're recommending for this reason. Where it says unless, when a person's reading this ordinance, they don't know how that unless has turned out. They read a person, as Mr. Barnwell was just suggesting with the cross-referencing and so forth, giving people direction on how to comply with the ordinance. If you add in terms like unless something happens, the ordinance now all of a sudden is not self-explanatory. A person doesn't know whether or not they have to comply with the ordinance or not, whether or not the ordinance is still in effect. They have to go to another step of saying, okay, has that shoe dropped? Which way did the shoe drop? Is it still in effect? Is it not in effect? And so what the City Attorney's Office recommends is to have the sunset as a definitive term, with the understanding that this committee, as well as the City Council has had, and staff has been operating with in the development of this ordinance, that when the 2008 standards have been brought out and we've had a chance to look at them, we decide whether or not the city needs to revise this ordinance or simply remove the sunset. It doesn't mean that it's automatically going to happen that the city can address the sunset issue even prior to the sunset occurring. It just means that we're with the sunset in place, we are assured of avoiding a conflict with the state regulations.
Mr. House.
Mr. Vincent, let's put it the other way. What if we don't have a sunset for this? And then if the 2008 revision comes out, we take a look at it and we say, oh, we need to re-up this, or we need to leave it alone. But we use that as a prompt to review it. But why do we need to sunset it?
The purpose of a sunset is to avoid a potential conflict between the city's ordinance and the state regulations. The city is allowed by state statute to go beyond the state requirements. However, it cannot conflict with the state requirements if in the sense of allowing something that is less stringent. We don't know the revisions to the state standards yet, and so we can't know for sure whether or not a conflict will arise when they are adopted.
I really understand that, and I know that we're still taking testimony, but I would want us to discuss a little bit further that would automatically kick us into a review of this if we would find that we would be inconsistent, that would be the trigger for us to review our ordinance, even if we didn't have an automatic turnoff for the ordinance.
Mr. Casey.
If I could have Mr. Gable talk about the approval process at the Energy Commission as well, which the sunset clause might come into play.
The Energy Commission, their policy has been they prefer to reapprove ordinances, local ordinances, under the new code. I'm not their attorney and I can't speak on their behalf, but their tradition has been they prefer to revisit any code just to be sure that nothing has changed, or even if the ordinance hasn't changed, if the Title 24 standard has changed, if some conflict arises. So I think you might not get a large objection from them, but you might get some pushback from them in preferring to do what Mr. Vincent's suggesting.
Mr. Vincent, do you have anything further to add?
No.
Mr. Hunt.
If I may add a couple of comments. Dave will talk about our suggested additional findings, which do kind of set the stage for revisiting the ordinance either in a year or 2 years upon expiration or upon any conflict with state law. I would add, though, that I think under Mr. Vincent's rationale for keeping it as is, you could just as well take it out and then in a year revisit. And then finally, it's certainly up to your attorneys to decide what the authority the CEC actually has. It is our reading that they do not have authority to actually approve anything after your initial submission, and it's fairly clear in the statute, in our opinion.
Isn't the 1 year sort of a misnomer and possibly inaccurate? I mean, we are looking at when the state legislation takes effect, and that, as we all know, may have a particular date on it, but may or may not come to pass in that particular date. Is it not true that this would remain in its current state and in effect until that legislation takes effect? That is the trigger that Mr. House was talking about. And at that point, aren't we sort of automatically duty-bound to review to make sure there are no conflicts?
I would agree with that.
Mr. Vincent.
Madam Chair, you're correct in your reading of the ordinance, and you're correct in the fact that while the state has been given a timeline, the State Energy Commission has been given a timeline to adopt new regulations, there's no guarantee.
We all know how that works.
There's no guarantee that that those regulations will be in effect within that timeline, and we purposely chose the effective date of the new revised state regulations as the sunset date, as opposed to some other application date or a fixed date, so that this ordinance will have its greatest effect without having the potential for conflicts with the revised regulations when they do come into effect.
Well, I would suggest that in an effort not to get bogged down in wordsmithing and in language, that we address the actual issue, which is the trigger of the state law, making our job partly to review what we have in place. Now, we can choose at that time to surpass it, which we're doing now, or we can choose to comply with that standard. So I think that if we can talk about addressing that issue, because that's where we all agree, And that's where we all want to get. So instead of quibbling about language, let's address the actual issue of the trigger of the revision. Mr. Hunt.
I think Dave's going to speak to those issues, so I will retire. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Davis. You just can't stay out of trouble, can you?
Actually, this is not trouble. This
No,
is
it's
actually
great.
a pleasure.
Thank you for bringing it.
A pleasure to be here. And let me not forget the issue that we're dealing with in expiration. But you have our letter, which a year ago, right, we all sat in that room with Ed Mazzaria and heard how we as local officials, local communities, can actually effectuate energy savings, conservation, and affect the production of greenhouse gases. And we all walked away going, my goodness, we actually can make a difference. So I want to basically say you guys are really needed to be complimented on moving this along. You as council, when we came back to you as a coalition after the Mazzaria thing, you accepted the challenge and you told your staff to move forward, and move forward they did at expeditious rate. Hiring Mr. Gable, he's been fantastic. He's worked with us as a coalition. You held the 2 workshops. We've been in phone conversations reviewing the ordinance since last summer. It has had lots of technical review. One of those technical reviews is that our, if you will, mechanical, electrical engineers, they don't believe that the code's really going to be more stringent than what you have here. I really like Mr. House's idea. If you don't have an expiration date, if the new code comes into effect and you need to update it, you're mandated to do it, and you'll just do it. But it doesn't give this idea that this only lasts so long. The intent is, if this is better than what state law is doing, let it stay in effect. You don't have to do anything at that particular point. If it isn't, you will be mandated to change it and update it, which is what you would do anyway, even if we didn't have this ordinance before you. The current code doesn't expire. It just gets supplanted by state law. We've also suggested a couple tiebacks to the Architecture 2030 in the findings section, and that is really to remind everybody the second phase of this energy conservation, the second phase having to do with the progressive nature of trying to get cities and communities to be carbon neutral. They're in the findings section. We believe it basically, again, kind of reinforces the council's intent to be progressive in this area. I also want to tell you that not only did we meet at the workshops that your staff put on, but we put on 3 training sessions for architects, engineers, and mechanical people to tell them how that could be done. And they were really well attended. At the annual meeting, the Contractors Association, AIA, we also made presentations to the chamber, to ASHRAE, which are the heating and refrigeration and electrical people, as well as to the Home Builders Association, right? And very frankly, it's been very interesting going out to them. Timing was on our side because this issue is very timely, and we've received very positive feedback from all those organizations. We'd suggest probably at this point that you incorporate our 2 findings if you could, and we've written those out and submitted those as an attachment. And then I think we would support Mr. House's idea, taking away the expiration and letting state law basically rule as it normally would. But let me tell you, again, the city, you as council people and the staff, really to be commended. This is a great step for Santa Barbara. And as Tam said, there are other cities which have stringent energy efficiency ordinances. Palm Desert, Santa Monica, Berkeley, San Francisco. But what you've done basically is tie it to the Architecture 2030 challenge, and we think that is really commendable. So, yeah, we have no other comments. Hope you would pass this. If you do, onto the council. We'll be doing some advertising during the week to get people to be at your hearing at the council on the 23rd. So, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Hunt, did you have something else?
One more relevant comment. The State Utilities Commission is about to approve a very far-reaching decision that will impact all private sector buildings in the state. And they actually have suggested using their incentive-led authority through the utilities, not as a mandate, but as an incentive-led, what they call a programmatic initiative, to achieve zero net energy buildings for all new residential construction by 2020 and zero net energy for all new commercial buildings by 2030. So very far-reaching, very visionary. Mr. Gable and our organization had a role in those workshops at the PUC, and so I wanted to mention this as something coming down the pike to help local builders achieve these goals you're setting. So it's not like we're doing this in a vacuum. There's a statewide trend, a nationwide trend that is happening as people realize the magnitude of the problems and the savings. This stuff saves money. You may have small capital cost increase in the beginning, but you will certainly save money if you're smart about it in a fairly short period of time. Thank you.
And I'll just confirm that at the annual conference that we had, League of California Cities, the vendors' booths that you have, several, maybe 1,000 vendors that are there, the number of them that had green technologies and green assistances for of all different levels for municipalities and local governments to avail themselves of was by far and away the most prominent theme of the entire thing. So I know we're not doing this in a vacuum. We just may be leading it along a little bit, which is a terrific thing. Thank you so much for your help. And I'm not sure how my colleagues feel. I am cautious not to adopt language that hasn't been analyzed right here on the dais. I think it's only prudent to send that back to staff to have it analyzed, and if it's okay, then we can move forward. But I am a little cautious not to do it sort of knee-jerk from here, although I trust you implicitly. So let's see now. Mr. House. Is staff finished with their presentation then?
Okay, I just wanted to start working on this here, and one of the places I wanted to start was at the definition section, because I didn't see this low-rise, high-rise thing there, and it seems like it belongs there. But then it raises, sort of begs another question, and that is, in a city like Santa Barbara, where a three-story building that would be considered low-rise may have a fourth-story element, and it might be just a very small additional part of the whole structure. Why do we make this distinction at all? Why not at a local level, which would be, again, more stringent than the state requirements, just not make a distinction between low-rise and high-rise? We don't have high-rise buildings here. 4 stories is as high as any new structure will ever get built, and I would suggest that, given that it is more stringent than the requirements of the state, that we could do that here and be more appropriate locally.
I could take a crack at that. Sorry, I could take a crack at that. The permit applicants in the state of California have to meet the state code, and the state code makes these unfortunate distinctions in some cases. So if someone is doing a 4-story building with 3 stories of apartments over, let's say, 1-story retail, George's office gets calculations for a permit, which have to be done in accordance with the state law. It's really not appropriate to then demand the permit applicant also meet some other set of calculational requirements that the state has for low-rise buildings on top of that, because there's an inconsistency there. So we're kind of caught within the structures that the state defines. Okay. That's sort of the bad news. The good news is anyone who comes to the counter to turn stuff into the building department already knows all this stuff, knows which set of calculations to turn in. So it's just taking the existing method and pushing the envelope, so to speak.
Well, let me ask the question another way.
Okay.
Why is there then, for the small additional amount of actual structure, since we're not really talking about 4, 5, 10, 30, 60-story buildings, which is high-rise in the big urban setting, why do we make any distinction whatsoever in terms of the percentage of exceedance?
It's because the calculational methods are different fundamentally and structurally, and exceeding the 20% in low-rise is essentially equivalent to meeting the 15% that are in the high-rise. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. The state requirements and the way the calculation, they're actually using a different calculational method under the hood. Okay. So it's really arcane, and I can go into as much as you'd like. But basically,
here's what I need to hear. It's important because there's a built-in kind of incentive here that I want to avoid. Mm-hmm. So as a layperson, it looks like you're getting a bonus for going a little bigger. And what I'm looking for here is a sense that there's equivalency between when you use the 2 different methods, that you actually come out with the same basic.
Actually, it turns out the opposite. It turns out that the 15% is like going 25% better in the low-rise residential. The 15% is comparing itself to a very, very stringent set of standards that the Commission has imposed on so-called high-rise buildings, which are more stringent window requirements for thermal efficiency and some other things than they require for low-rise buildings. So actually, the 15% is not a bargain. If someone's going to try to manipulate their building, it's better for them to keep it 20% better for a 3-story building than to go 4-story, because it gets really, really tough in practice. So,
Mr. Casey may have something to add to that.
Well, I just want to try to phrase it again so that we kind of understand it. And that, again, looking at our local ordinance is kind of an overlay of the state requirements, and that the state requirements are already harder for those high-rise types of buildings compared to the low-rise. So then when we overlay our requirements to make them even harder, you're building off a higher base for the high-rise buildings. And so it is equivalent. Your question is, are you getting a bang for the buck? Would you want to game the system to add a small 4th-story component to get the easy requirements? And that's not the case, because the state requirements are already harder on those higher
Okay, then
buildings.
you're really hearing my concern. Now let me just go one step further, and that is, in the process we're going to go through to have this approved, and I don't expect some great opposition, given especially that there's been outreach to the building community, which is really important. I don't know where and how we get to say that, but it needs to be said. Because for anybody reading this that doesn't know what you just said, doesn't understand or have that understanding, it would appear to be that there was some bonus provision built in here for adding a 4th story or even a 4th-story element. And so maybe there's explanatory text, or maybe in the definitions there could be a simple phrase or two that identifies that the calculations result in an equivalency, or even maybe even works the other way. But somewhere, I think that for the public's benefit, not necessarily for the practitioners, but for the public, there should be some acknowledgement of what you just described to me so well. In the definitions, I just honestly had it's very trite, I think, but G and I, the difference between a swimming pool and a water feature, I wonder maybe you could put another look at that, because it doesn't help a whole lot, and I don't know if it's important, but just it doesn't get us very far. On the applicability section on page 3, there just below 2282.030 applicability, the question I have on number 2. Any addition to an existing building or structure that is greater than 100 square feet of continued floor area. Conditioned floor area. My question is this applying to just the addition, or does it trigger the entire structure?
That's just the addition, because that's the way the state defines the trigger with respect to the Title 24 code.
Okay. Okay. And if there's any way, I for one read it that it could possibly be a trigger for the whole structure, so maybe there needs to be, maybe it's not necessary to explain it, but I think that could happen, that could be misinterpreted.
I think, Mr. Vincent and I can try to work on making that a bit clearer.
Okay.
Madam Chair, and Mr. Gable can correct me if I'm misunderstanding this. How the 100 square foot triggers applicability of the chapter to the proposal. Whether the chapter applies to just the addition or the addition and other elements of the project is a choice of the applicant in how they do their compliance methodology. So if an applicant chooses to use the existing addition plus alteration compliance methodology, that gives them more flexibility to consider not just the energy use of the additional 100 square feet, but to find efficiencies elsewhere in the building and have the whole thing considered. Is that an accurate interpretation?
I think actually Mr. House is correct, that I think we need clarity in saying that the trigger is the conditioned area of the new square footage of the addition, and just the misplaced modifier there. I think it's just a point of clarifying.
That's good. And what about this? Because what Mr. Vincent just said to me helps me understand why there are more than one ways to make the computation. And if it's so that it rigorously would apply to just the new square footage. But also you could use the computation of the entire structure or just the addition. You have these two options. Then I think there needs to be some clarification in that, because I can see the methodology outlined here both for residential and for the others, and it shows the variety of ways of computing. And I think that, again, leads us to that question as to how that works for the variety of ways of computing too. So, okay, good. Well, those are questions then that need to be, you could help us out a little bit. On page 8, where it says documentation, just a small question here. It says to demonstrate that the general compliance requirements of this chapter have been met, a permit applicant may be required by a building official, so there's discretion there, may be required by the building official to submit. Then it says necessary and adequate supplementary forms, and it goes on to say as determined appropriate by the building official. And it seems, this may be wordsmithing, it just seems redundant. Necessary and adequate, I guess we could just take those out. It says determined by the building official, really, right? There's no other, is there another level of, another tier here that I'm missing, or is it just up to the building official?
Essentially, it's up to the building.
Okay, good. Then because when I first read it, I thought maybe there's more to this than meets the eye. Okay. And then, the big question I had sort of at the tail end we've already addressed had to do with the expiration issue, and I favor my idea for some reason. Let's see. I think that's all for right now.
How honestly put. Mr. Barnwell.
Don't I remember that on an occasional basis, the city of Santa Barbara adopts new versions of the Uniform Building Code, and in so doing adopts a small number of its own kind of addenda to the building code? Isn't that what we do?
Mr. Estrad.
Yes, as a matter of fact, we do, and we will be bringing adoption of new codes in the next
week, I
couple of
believe.
weeks. Yes.
What is the language associated with that process? Does it say everything expires, or does it just let it ride until it's updated and then we update it?
Actually, it's determined by the Building Standards Commission that actually has the adoption dates and the end dates. And so, for example, the dates for the new codes become effective January 1, 2008, at which time local jurisdictions, which we're in the process of adopting, can adopt local amendments due to...
but I want to get to but it seems to me there's a parallel with what we're doing right here. Here we're asking about a state code with our own little addendums to it, and we have that same process. But I don't remember that the process that we have with regard to the UBC has this, quote, expiration component to it. Am I right on that? Because it seems like at one point they didn't get around to revising it in time, and so there was a lag.
Right.
Nothing expired. It just stayed in effect until they got their ducks all in a row, redid it, then we re-upped it along with our...
Let me try to explain it this way. Unless the state gives an end date of the codes, our amendments are allowed to continue, whatever is at the local
Why can't we
condition.
follow that in this case?
Mr. Casey,
Madam Chair, Mr.
Vincent,
Barnwell.
you're both grabbing for your mics here.
Maybe I'll try first, and then Mr. Vincent can correct me. And Mr. Gable can talk about it as well. The state legislation that's set up that covers Title 24 says that the Energy Commission must approve local ordinance changes, which is a little bit different from our local adoption of the building codes and addressing addendum. So we're working under a little different scenario than the building codes that you're referencing, Mr. Barnwell. And just to kind of help the discussion, I've been thinking about the option of A, leaving the language the way we have it written in the draft ordinance because we think that's what the Energy Commission might be looking for, or just removing it completely and see if the Energy Commission and their staff will be fine with that. I think those are two perfectly good options, and we do need to bring this ordinance back to the council, and one thought might be is that we could check with the Energy Commission prior to coming back to council and say, how important is this expiration date to you? Is it okay if we don't have one, but we understand the practical effect? But I think our interest is having an ordinance that can get approved by the Energy Commission sooner rather than later. And so I don't think we necessarily want to do something that's going to slow us down and bog us down in a regulatory question.
Okay,
and so
well,
that might be
thanks.
an option for us to consult with them on the expiration issue and see what they think.
And
then to get to the CEC's point of view, they have in the findings that we need to come back and revisit this issue at the adoption of the new energy code. And so I think that would address that issue as well.
Okay.
Mr. Vincent has something to add.
Madam Chair, thank you. I would suggest that the proposed expiration by staff is actually following the process that the Uniform Building Code adoption has historically, which is the city's local amendments stay in effect until the next state statutes come down, or state regulations come down.
Right.
And the way that the building code process has historically occurred and is currently occurring is that the state comes out and says, here's our new proposed building code. And then they do that basically in July. And they say, this building code will be your building code as of January 1 of the following year, unless you adopt your local amendments prior to January 1. Hence, why we're scrambling and getting this thing done by the end of this month so that it has its effective date prior to January 1. So, in that same vein, to have an expiration where our local changes, our local amendments to the efficiency standards expire as of the effective date of the new state standards, we would undertake a similar process. When the state publishes its new revised standards, there will be a period of time before they become effective, and staff can review our ordinance and determine whether we just remove the expiration and have everything continue on, whether there needs to be changes to the ordinance. There will be time to do that. And so the key thing for me with regard to the expiration is that it's a safe gap measure that, just like the state meeting its deadlines, if for some reason we don't meet our deadline, the expiration as proposed by staff assures that there will not be a conflict between the city's ordinance and the state regulations.
Well, we could go on and on this, but one of the things that I am not confident of is that we are ensuring that this ordinance will be in effect. I see somehow through the language an expiration of our ordinance and then an interregnum during which our ordinance does not apply, and yet portions of it should. The state may be more stringent, but not in all areas. And so the part of it that bothers me is that gap where then we're going to go back and either revise ours or in some other way patch together during that bridge time between the approval of this and the approval of the next one. And that's why the expiration bothers me. It seems like you get a 6-month period where somebody could kind of come in and say, well, your ordinance isn't really in effect now because the state is a little more stringent in some areas but not in others. You're following my line of reasoning? That's the part of it that bothers me. I don't know if that's what bothers Mr. House too, but it always bothers me when you have these termination points unless we're really on top of it. And it sounds like it's going to be another process for us to approve whatever changes when this expires. They all have to be approved by the CEC as well. And so my argument to the CEC would be happy to do that, but don't want a gap in coverage.
Mr. Gable.
I've been through this with the county of Marin. Marin County, north of San Francisco, had an ordinance that was under the 2001 state code, and then it had to be revised into the 2005 code. And it was really very simple. They just made a decision to continue essentially the same ordinance with no changes.
Yeah.
But we had plenty of time, and we just redid some cost study analysis just to show it was still cost effective. Okay. And we had plenty of time, and they approved it well in advance of the new code. So I think either way, in practice, doesn't matter. I think there'll be plenty of time to make tweaks if you want to, and if you don't want to make tweaks, there'll be plenty of time to just have it reapproved, I think.
The practical application, it seems to me, is that there really isn't a gap, that the code continues until such time that we amend it. So if the state preempts or supplants certain portions of it, the rest of it continues. I think that to err on the better side of discretion or valor here, I think taking the language out altogether just really alleviates those concerns that I don't think have real practical application on the ground, but I can see how theoretically it may cause some concern. So I think I'm going to err on the side of just
well, I can understand
avoiding the ambiguity.
Mr. Casey's point, which is that we got to get this approved by the CEC, and so they're kind of like in the driver's seat. Here we are wanking here in Santa Barbara,
right.
But so I understand that. Okay, just gave you my thought on it. The other thing there's a couple other points that I would like to be more clear on because I'm just not clear on this. with a little bit of backstory, when Miss Jane Brown comes with her CEC hat on, she speaks to us about lighting, almost exclusively. Indeed, has press releases and hands out lamps and bulbs. And it is seen by the Edison Company and other power suppliers as a huge component of how we reduce our consumption of electricity not in a capital construction cost way, but in an ongoing maintenance cost way when you build a building. And I'm a believer in looking at both of those budgets together, not just a building of a building and then the maintenance process. So with that thought in mind, when I look at page 3 and I see the applicability, item number 3 says indoor lighting alterations greater than 100 square feet. So a couple of things come to my mind. How does this ordinance, or Title 24 as it's now written, mandate certain bulbs? I don't want to get too persnickety, but how does it mandate that you have a energy efficient bulb? It doesn't, does it?
No, that's correct. The standards don't mandate any specific technology. But the way the standards work is that when you define a space, this is a meeting space, this is a council chamber, there's an allowed wattage per square foot allowed. And you multiply the wattage per square foot times the square feet, and you allow that kind of wattage. Now, you can get credit for occupant sensors. There are all sorts of ways of building in credits for sensors and so forth. But you can design the space however you want to, but you're not to exceed a certain installed wattage. And so it gives ultimate flexibility, but there's also, let me say one more thing, there's no insistence on adequate lighting design. It's just a maximum amount of wattage. So you have to have someone who's a good designer to make sure you have adequate illumination for that wattage.
Right, and you can plug in as many lamps as you want in the outlet, right?
That's true.
Well,
receptacle lights are not covered by the standards.
Yeah, so you're just talking about typically it's
permanently
installed light, right? And ballast,
correct.
Fluorescence, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, next question. If lighting is important, and if a lot of lighting goes outside the building, you say that's Title 22 of the state? What were you telling me about? How is state lighting, outdoor lighting, handled by the state?
There's two different things. There's the local ordinance and local lighting requirements, but the state of California has, as of 2005, new outdoor call it hardscape lighting. It doesn't actually cover landscape. It covers walkways, driveways, parking lots, lights, exterior light, signage, lighting on buildings, and there is a prescriptive method separate from the performance calculation on that category of lighting, which a building owner, permanent applicant, has to meet and submit to the building official to show compliance with the relatively new state standard on that category of lighting.
Well, this is good. I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression. I think this is great. I'm going to say yes to this. Send it off. Blessings, et cetera, et cetera. But we just still don't have a grip on the reason that we have this. The reason that we have this is we want to reduce energy consumption every possible way we can. And we're tagging on to a state code, but how are we also going to get all of these other energy consumption levels reduced significantly? And one of them is the outdoor lighting. How do we do that? This isn't doing it. This is only the building envelope. It doesn't even include, best I can tell, if you took building envelope to its precise definition, it doesn't even include the front porch light. Now, it probably does because it's being switched on from the inside, so it's part of that electrical system. But anyway, I think we got more work to do.
Let me suggest a couple of things. First of all, I think the advantage of taking our time in the next time around, because if there's a next time around to show compliance with the new state code, we'll have more time to explore that issue. I mean, I think it's a complicated issue. We had to do what we could do within a reasonable time frame with respect to...
No, I understand it.
No, right. So I think that's a good idea, and I think that's something that all of us can think about. And I think also the state will have worked out the bugs in the methodology in the system, which clearly appeared the first time around 2 years ago, which I'm sort of directly involved in helping fix the problems, because there's a lot of vague language and poorly understood ways in which permit applicants meet that requirement currently. So I didn't think the city should wade into those waters until they resolve that. But I think, assuming that it's improved for the 2008 code, I think what you're suggesting is definitely reasonable.
Well, I consider it very, very important. It's also something that the citizens notice. The outside lighting when they're on the Riviera Ridge, and we all get letters from them saying, my God, those lights down at the train station are horrible, and we're constantly trying to reduce them. Some of them are municipal, many of them are private. And we do have a lighting ordinance, but the degree to which we incorporate that as the entire overarching look at our energy consumption is the degree to which I then become happy in my heart. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. But I do think it's very good. I like what you've done. I appreciate all the hard work. Oh, one other question. Swimming pools. I thought they had to be solar heated anyway. Don't swimming pools... What made me think that when you built a swimming pool it had to have a solar hot water heater component?
Well,
no?
I think there are some requirements about solar water heaters. I think there has to be, plumbing. The plumbing has to be there to provide direct access to the addition of a solar thermal system, but also pools don't have to be heated. So this addresses the issue is when someone chooses to mechanically heat a pool, then the efficiency of that pool heater has to be a certain requisite level. So it's pushing the envelope on that, too.
Well, there's something also, when we get around to that at some other point, that makes me want to say if you want to put in a pool, it's got to have solar heat. Now, whether that represents 100% of the source of heat or whether it represents a component of it, but I don't think we should be using our precious resources to heat swimming pools if, by definition, it's out there in the sunshine. The pool is. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Well, we have the big solar in the sky that usually does that in the west here for us. Mr. House, you have something else?
I did, and I didn't want to step on your toes. You might have a few things to say too. But to this whole expiration thing, I just had an idea of a direction that I would like it to go that maybe would resolve it a little bit. There's two pieces. One is that it would be worded in the positive, that this chapter 2282, in whole or part, shall remain in effect until new state building energy efficiency standards make whole or part of it inconsistent with the standards. And then the second part would be the severability clause, which would identify that the finding of any particular part, any part of this chapter shall not make, of inconsistency, shall not make the rest of it inconsistent. Something like that, so that we're really showing the determination to continue with this past whatever changes the state has. There may also be a procedural part which would identify what we would do if something were found to be inconsistent with the state standards, and that it would initiate a revision or a review. But those would be the two or three parts of a piece here that would really go where I would want to go. I don't like the way it's worded because it puts us in a position of having, I mean, for instance, as a planning commissioner, we all know this, we get this stack of new leaves to put in our pieces of our, our monster book, right? It didn't, like, the whole thing didn't expire when there was some new things that got added. We put the new language in, and the same thing for our building code. I really think this is going to be a piece of the threads that are woven together for our city's view on energy, and I don't want to see us talk about when it expires, but what we do when it becomes inconsistent and how we handle that. So I put that out there. Maybe you could come up with some language in that direction, if or not. Let me know.
Law libraries employ staff specifically to update languages. So this is the normal course of business. I mean, this is how we go about doing things. Whether or not it's expressed outwardly in this particular document, I'm not sure if that's necessary or if it's just omitted. I'm a little bit confused about where to proceed from here, because we have some proposed new language that needs analysis. We have this sort of quagmire about the expiration or the revisions upon inconsistency with state law that needs to be worked out, and the inquiry to the CEC as to whether or not they are looking for a specific language that speaks to expiration upon state law being enacted or coming down. So I don't want to hang it up, so I would like to very much entertain a motion to move it to council, but we have these items that are sort of, I don't want to say hanging chads, but, they're out there just kind of, we haven't quite finished our job with this in order to be able to send it up. Mr. Casey, Mr. Vincent, I would appreciate some guidance.
Well, Madam Chair and Ordinance Committee members, I think the two findings that were proposed today, we don't have any objections to it. It's really kind of a statement of fact and principle that Council's been supportive of in the past.
So you feel like you've had a chance to look at this language sufficiently? I see Mr. Wiley has come to the front.
I think so. And I'll let Mr. Wiley talk before I finish.
Mr. Wiley.
Well, on the findings, I agree with Paul. Findings are just legislative history, just background. It's not binding.
If you're
It's
okay,
just
I'm okay.
If you like the background information, then adopt the findings. And as I say, it's just explanation. Let me mention a couple things about the the expiration of the last section of the ordinance. What Scott and I have been trying to avoid, and the point we've been trying to make, and this is a general point on drafting ordinances, ordinances pretty much have to be black and white. You have to either know what's on or off. Is it or if you use a conclusionary word, you have to say who makes the conclusion. For example, if there was a draft of this that said, these shall be revised in the future if. If what? Who decides if happens? Now, if you had said the building official could decide, that would work. I don't personally think it's appropriate for a city council to defer its legislative authority to a determination by a building official. So we weren't recommending that. Similarly, Mr. House, when you mentioned inconsistency, it's a conclusionary term. Who decides whether something's inconsistent? It's a big question mark at the point you adopt it. So that in an ordinance, that doesn't work. So I think we're back to the language that's in there now, which it's my understanding, and I have to say I don't have anywhere near the background on this as Mr. Casey or Mr. Gable or Mr. Vincent. My understanding that this is the kind of thing the State Energy Commission is looking for, and that's why Mr. Gable's recommended that to us. We can take it out altogether. But I don't think we can avoid the fact that we have to revisit this when the new state code comes in. And it's really your question about the Uniform Building Code. It's the exact same process. I believe it's the same government code statutes about either the state codes become your local ordinance unless within that 6-month period you adopt your local amendments. We're going to have to do that regardless. So
what I hear you saying, actually, is that it's language that is more placating to the institution that needs to pass this ordinance than it has real effect.
that's what our consultants tell us.
That's what our consultants tell us. Well, Mr. Gable? All right. So where do we stand? Mr. House.
I actually heard Mr. Gable say that it may not make that big of a difference. Then again, with the idea that if we were in front of the CEC without this clause in here, without this phrase of the expiration, and they said, hey, what about the expiration thing? You go, well, okay, I tell you what, we just happen to bring it with us here, you know. But I really prefer to start without it there. I think that our goal is to send a signal that we are trying very hard to make this part of where we're going in the future, and I don't want to send this signal to our local community, at least, that this is something that's just a one-year fix and it's going to be over and we don't have to worry about it anymore.
Mr. Wiley.
I just want to mention one possibly minor problem. We've got to introduce this ordinance, and once we introduce it, we can't change it at the adoption. So we have to have the language, and I believe the plan was to introduce this next Tuesday. So we got to figure this out today. And I believe that the idea is to take an introduced ordinance to the CEC, not just a possible ordinance that the City Council of Santa Barbara might introduce, but an actual.
No, they don't want us to waste their time like
right, that an actual introduced ordinance. So we've got to fix the language before we introduce it. or decided.
Okay, here's what I'm going to do, because I'm going to probably still be on the ordinance committee when this comes back around again. I'm going to make a motion that we use this language that's here right now in the expiration thing, and then once we've gotten our approval and it comes back around again somewhere between now and a year from now or somewhere in there, I'm going to remember this, and we're going to perhaps change the language at that point, because I really would like it to express where we're going with this, and without any conditions, we're going to take those away. And with the comments that you've heard from us today, with the addition of the findings, with the improvements to some of the language that we discussed here, and an understanding that the definitions will be strengthened, I move that we adopt this to send to the City Council for adoption.
As is, including the findings.
Yes.
There's a motion.
Second.
All right. I am almost completely satisfied that the language has no practical effect and that we're bound to do the updates, and there will be certain consistencies or inconsistencies, and we'll be revising this as we do the building code and all the various other codes and infinitum and to perpetuity. So I'm okay with going forward with the language. I do not want to see it hung up. I want to see it passed by the CEC, and I think you've done yeoman's work, and I want to thank our CEC for all the help, and Mr. Gable for all your able assistance. I do think the notion that this is a permanent direction for the city of Santa Barbara is one that can't be overstated. And so with that knowledge, and hopefully that will be put out there in no uncertain terms, that this is the direction that we're going, whether or not the ordinance language talks about some sort of hypothetical expiration or not is irrelevant. This is the future of Santa Barbara, and there should be no mistake about that. So with that, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously, as
Madam Chair,
is
I have one
with
more
the
thing.
findings on to City Council. Post haste. Mr. House.
Yes, and may I request that the staff consider in their presentation to City Council a description of how we will be dealing with the potential revision that's in the future, where, as Mr. Vincent was describing, we would get the decision that we'd hear from the state, and then we'd immediately begin our own process of reviewing and revising ours to continue to be a little bit ahead of the state, so that we actually identify that process for council. So when they make their motion and approve this, they'll be knowing where we're going with it. All right.
Any further comments from anyone? With that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.